Second chance romance finds true love. The grand ballroom revisited. The grand ballroom shimmered with elegance, just as it had 5 years ago. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the medical ball, where laughter and the murmur of conversations mingled with the soft strains of a string quartet. Amelia stood near the entrance, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the event itself. It had been years since she'd last worn an evening gown, and the silky fabric of her emerald green dress felt foreign against her skin, a reminder of how much her life had changed. She smoothed the delicate lace at her wrist, her fingers trembling slightly. Tonight felt like stepping into a life she'd left behind, one she had barely dared to hope for. Amelia adjusted the cuff of her dress and surveyed the room, her nerves a tangle of excitement and unease. She was here at the invitation of her best friend Claire, who had insisted she come. "You've been hiding from the world long enough," Claire had said. "It's time to celebrate how far you've come." And so, Amelia had agreed, though the thought of facing the medical community again, the people who had saved her life, left her feeling exposed, as if her scars were still visible for all to see. Her eyes swept the room, catching on a familiar figure near the champagne fountain, Dr. Ethan Cross. The name echoed in her mind like a melody she hadn't heard in years. He stood with a group of colleagues, his laughter warm and easy, just as she remembered. He hadn't changed much. The same confident posture, the same thoughtful eyes. Memories flooded back, unbidden. The sterile walls of the oncology ward, late-night conversations laced with hope and fear, and the ache she'd felt when she'd walked away from that chapter of her life. 6 years. That's how long it had been since their last meeting. 6 years since she'd finished her treatment for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and walked out of the hospital, determined to leave it all behind. She'd told herself it was for the best. He had been her hematologist, after all. Any feelings that might have bloomed between them had been tangled in ethical impossibilities. And yet, seeing him now, she realized those feelings hadn't faded. If anything, they'd been waiting, dormant, for this very moment. Her breath hitched, and she took a step back, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "What am I doing here?" she thought, panic rising in her chest. "I'm not ready for this. I can't." She turned toward the exit, her pulse pounding in her ears. But before she could take another step, Claire appeared at her side, a glass of champagne in hand. "There you are," Claire said, her voice bright. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You're not thinking of leaving already, are you?" Amelia forced a smile, though her hands were clammy. I don't know if I can do this, Claire." Claire's expression softened. "Hey, it's just a party. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But you've come this far. Don't let fear stop you now." Amelia nodded, though her stomach churned. She glanced back toward Ethan, who was now scanning the room, his brow furrowed as if searching for someone. Her heart leapt into her throat. What if he's looking for me? The thought was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Ethan's perspective. Ethan had been distracted all evening. The ball was a blur of familiar faces and polite conversation, but his mind kept wandering back to her. Amelia? He hadn't seen her in 6 years. Not since she'd walked out of the hospital, her treatment complete, her future uncertain. He'd thought about her often, more often than he cared to admit. There had been moments over the years when he'd almost reached out, typed her name into a search bar, or asked a mutual acquaintance how she was doing. But he'd always stopped himself. She'd been his patient, and crossing that line, even after her treatment ended, had felt like a betrayal of the trust she'd placed in him. But tonight, as he stood in the ballroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be here. He'd heard through the grapevine that she'd been invited, and though he told himself it was ridiculous to hope, he couldn't help scanning the crowd for her face. When their eyes met across the room, his breath caught. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, though there was a nervousness in her expression that made his chest tighten. He excused himself from his group and made his way toward her, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. The reunion. "Amelia," he said, his voice a blend of surprise and warmth, "I almost didn't recognize you." "It's been a while," she replied, her own smile trembling on her lips. You look well, Ethan. So do you. His gaze held hers, as if trying to piece together the years they'd been apart. How have you been? Good, she said, nodding. Life has been kind to me lately. And you? He hesitated, then chuckled. Busy. The hospital keeps me on my toes, but I can't complain. For a moment, they stood there, words unsaid hovering between them. Then he gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. Do you want to catch up? It's a bit noisy here. She nodded, but before she could answer, a voice interrupted them. Doctor Cross. There you are. We need you for the toast. It was Dr. Patel, his colleague, clapping him on the shoulder. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Give me a moment, he said, his eyes never leaving Amelia's. Wait for me? She nodded, though her heart sank as he walked away. The brief moment of connection felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The balcony. When Ethan returned, they found a small alcove near the balcony. The cool night air brushed against her skin, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from the garden below. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the hum of the ballroom faded into the background. I wasn't expecting to see you here, Ethan said, leaning against the railing. What brought you back tonight? A friend invited me, she explained. I thought it would be a nice way to reconnect with, well, everything. It's strange, isn't it? Coming back to something you thought you'd left behind. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've thought about you, you know. Over the years, wondered how you were doing. Her heart skipped a beat. I've thought about you too, more than I probably should have. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. Amelia, I wanted to say something back then, but it wasn't the right time. You were my patient. It would have been wrong. I know, she said softly. And I respected you for that. But it didn't make it any easier. He exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp night air. It's different now. We're different. If there's still something here, I don't want to let it slip away again. Her pulse quickened. She'd imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Ethan, she began, her voice trembling. It's been so long, I don't even know where to start. Start with this, he said, stepping closer. Do you want to see where this could go? She looked up at him, the weight of the past 6 years melting away under his steady gaze. For the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but undeniable. Yes, she whispered. I do. A smile broke across his face, and he reached for her hand, his touch warm against the cool night. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city and the distant music of the ball, they took the first steps toward a future they'd both been too afraid to dream of before. 5 years later. The ballroom was even grander than she remembered, though perhaps it was just the glow of the candles and the golden lights streaming through the windows. Amelia stood at the center of the room, her hand in Ethan's, as the string quartet played the same melody they'd danced to years ago. This time, though, the music wasn't a backdrop to uncertainty. It was a celebration. Do you remember this song? Ethan asked, his voice low and warm in her ear. How could I forget? She replied, smiling up at him. It was the night I realized I wasn't ready to let go of you. He pulled her closer, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, and I realized I'd been waiting for you all along. As they danced, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate necklace, its pendant a tiny, shimmering star. This is for you, he said, fastening it around her neck. A reminder that no matter how dark things get, we'll always find our way back to each other. Tears filled her eyes as she touched the pendant, its warmth a tangible symbol of everything they'd built together. I love you, Ethan, she said, her voice breaking, and I always will. He kissed her then, softly and deeply as the music swelled behind them. In that moment, surrounded by the people they loved and the city that had witnessed their journey, they knew that second chances weren't just possible, they were worth every step of the way. Flashback, the near reunion. 2 years after Amelia's treatment ended, she found herself standing outside the hospital on a rainy afternoon. She hadn't planned to come, she'd told herself she was done with that place. But something had drawn her there. Maybe it was the memory of Ethan's smile, or the way he'd always made her feel like she wasn't just another patient. She stood under the awning, her umbrella clutched tightly in her hand, watching the rain patter against the pavement. Inside, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He'd just finished a long shift and was about to head home when a notification popped up on his screen. It was a reminder for a patient follow-up, but his mind wandered to Amelia. He hadn't heard from her in 2 years, and though he told himself it was for the best, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd let something important slip away. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. For a moment, he thought he saw her standing there, but when he blinked, she was gone. He shook his head, chiding himself for imagining things. Still, the image lingered, a ghost of what might have been. The obstacle. Back at the ball, just as Amelia and Ethan were about to step onto the balcony, Claire appeared, her face flushed with excitement. "Amelia, there you are. I've been looking everywhere for you. They're about to announce the raffle winners, and I need you to come with me." Amelia hesitated, glancing at Ethan. "Can it wait?" Claire shook her head. "It'll only take a minute. Come on." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "Go ahead. I'll be here when you get back." Amelia nodded, though her heart sank as she followed Claire back into the ballroom. The delay felt like an eternity, and she couldn't shake the fear that the moment with Ethan would slip away. The wedding. 5 years later, they stood together on another evening, their wedding day, under the same golden light of a different ballroom. This time, there were no boundaries, no lost time, only the certainty that second chances were worth the wait. As they danced, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate necklace, its pendant a tiny, shimmering star. "This is for you," he said, fastening it around her neck, "a reminder that no matter how dark things get, we'll always find our way back to each other." Tears filled her eyes as she touched the pendant, its warmth a tangible symbol of everything they'd built together. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking, "and I always will." He kissed her then, softly and deeply, as the music swelled behind them. In that moment, surrounded by the people they loved and the city that had witnessed their journey, they knew that second chances weren't just possible. They were worth every step of the way. The proposal. A year before the wedding, Ethan had planned the perfect proposal. He took Amelia to the same balcony where they had reconnected at the medical ball. The city lights twinkled below, and the night air was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. He got down on one knee, holding out a ring that sparkled as brightly as the stars above. "Amelia," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves that threatened to overtake him. "You've been my guiding star through the darkest times. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. She threw her arms around him and they held each other tightly, knowing that their love had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The honeymoon. Their honeymoon was a dream come true. They traveled to a secluded island where the turquoise waters and white sandy beaches provided the perfect backdrop for their love. They spent their days exploring the island, swimming in the crystal clear waters, and their nights dancing under the stars. One evening, as they sat on the beach, watching the sun set over the horizon, Ethan turned to Amelia and said, "I can't believe how lucky I am to have you in my life." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We've been through so much, but it's all been worth it to be here with you." The future. As they danced at their wedding, surrounded by friends and family, Amelia and Ethan knew that their future was bright. They had faced their fears, overcome obstacles, and found their way back to each other. Their love was a testament to the power of second chances, and they were ready to embrace whatever the future held, together. As the music played and the night wore on, they danced and laughed, knowing that their love story was just beginning. And as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, hand in hand, heart in heart. The legacy. Years later, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard, Amelia turned to Ethan and said, Do you ever think about how far we've come? He smiled, taking her hand in his. Every day, and I'm grateful for every moment. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his love surround her. Me too, and I wouldn't change a thing. As they sat there watching the sunset and their children laugh, they knew that their love had created a legacy that would last a lifetime, and they were grateful for every step of the journey that had brought them to this moment.